Steam curled from the pot roast like a prayer rising toward the low rafters, filling the farmhouse kitchen with the smell of onions, pepper, and slow forgiveness. Mary stood at the head of the table, apron stiff with flour, cheeks red from the woodstove's heat, trying not to stare at the girl seated 3 places down. The girl's hair was cropped short, the way the army required, and her drab khaki dress hung on her frame as though it had been meant for someone larger. She kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers pressed together so tightly the knuckles whitened. Outside, the prairie wind rattled the windows. Inside, the room was so quiet that even the clock on the wall sounded hesitant. John, Mary's husband, sat at the far end of the table, shoulders still dusty from the barn, his presence as broad and unyielding as the fields outside. He had been the one to speak first when the military truck arrived that morning with its cargo of laborers. "We can use the help," he'd said. "The beans won't wait for politics." But Mary had not expected the help to be so young, or to be a woman. The girl's name was Liesel, though she spoke it softly, barely audible, as if names were dangerous. She was 19, maybe 20, though war had made her look older in the eyes and younger in the bones. She smelled faintly of soap and burlap. When she glanced up, it was quick, bird-like, as though she expected to be struck. The children stared. Sam, 7, balanced on his chair, tilting forward, fascinated by the gray cloth patch with its stenciled number sewn to Liesel's shoulder. Ruth, barely 5, sucked 2 fingers and peeked out from behind Mary's sleeve. Even the dog had lifted his head, ears cocked, suspicious. John cleared his throat. "Eat," he said, and the spell broke. Forks clattered against plates. The dog dropped back to the floor with a grunt. Liesel reached for nothing. She waited until Mary, after a moment's hesitation, slid the mashed potatoes her way. Liesel nodded once, murmured something that might have been thanks, and spooned a small heap onto her plate. Mary watched her closely. She had not wanted this girl here, not really. She had wanted the work done, yes, but she had not wanted to share her table, her food, her Sunday quiet. She had imagined the prisoners as faceless men in striped rags, not thin-shouldered girls with lashes too long for war. Conversation stumbled like a calf on icy ground. John asked about the weather, though everyone had seen the sky that morning, and remarked that the corn looked promising this year. Sam began to tell a story about the dog chasing a snake, but fell silent when Liesel looked at him with those wide, solemn eyes. The meal went on. The clink of forks filled the gaps where words might have been. Every so often Mary caught Liesel glancing toward the window, as though measuring the distance to the horizon. Halfway through the meal, something shifted. Ruth, emboldened, reached across the table and plucked at the cuff of Liesel's sleeve. "Why is your dress so funny?" she asked, her small voice direct as a bullet. Mary's heart thumped. But Liesel smiled, an almost shy thing, quick and crooked, and answered in careful English. "Because it is not a dress. It is uniform." The room held still for a beat. Then Sam giggled, and even John's stern mouth twitched. The air eased just slightly, like a door opening a crack. After supper, when the plates were scraped and the children had been shooed outside, Mary found Liesel standing near the sink, awkward, hands hovering as though asking for permission. Without a word, Mary handed her a towel. Together they worked in silence, washing and drying, the sound of water soft against the lingering clatter of dishes. Through the window, the last light of afternoon turned the stubbled fields gold. A hawk circled, its shadow passing over the barn roof. Somewhere out of sight, John's hammer rang against a loose hinge. The war felt impossibly far away, and impossibly near. Mary noticed that Liesel's hands, though chapped, were deft and careful, never slamming a dish or leaving a streak. Once their fingers brushed as Mary passed her a plate, and she felt the girl flinch, not from fear, but from surprise. When the last dish was put away, Liesel hesitated at the doorway, as if she might say something, but the words never came. She stepped outside, crossing the yard with a straight-backed posture that looked too disciplined for this quiet place. Mary lingered at the window long after she was gone, drying her hands on the apron, staring at the path that led back toward the camp. Something restless stirred in her chest, something between pity and defiance. She thought of the headlines that warned against fraternization, of the pastor's sermon about guarding one's home from the enemy. And yet, when she pictured Liesel's small, careful smile, the words enemy and girl no longer seemed to belong in the same sentence. She turned from the window to stir the fire, but the room felt different now, as though the girl had left a trace of herself in the air. The day had begun with fear, with the rattle of a truck carrying prisoners through the dust. It ended with a strange quiet, not quite peace, not quite war, and Mary found herself wondering, not for the last time, what tomorrow's supper might bring. The camp sat at the edge of town like a foreign thought no one wanted to finish, its barbed wire glinting in the sun, its guard towers stark against the sky. Inside, life ticked forward with a strange, military rhythm. Bugles at dawn, roll call under the pale light, the rattle of tin plates at noon. Liesel had learned the pattern quickly, moving through the days like a shadow among hundreds of others. The first mornings were the hardest. The air smelled of diesel and dust, and the sound of boots crunching on gravel brought back memories she tried not to hold too long. The women were kept in their own section, a handful of nurses, typists, and auxiliaries gathered from different units, strangers except for the shared weight they carried. At night they lay on their bunks and whispered to one another, the words slipping through the dark like moths. Some spoke of home with bright, brittle voices. Others kept silent, their faces turned to the wall. The Americans kept their promise of food and shelter, though the meals were simple, stew thick with beans, cornbread that crumbled in the hand. It was more than most of them had seen in months. Hunger had been their closest companion in the last year of the war, a gnawing thing that hollowed the ribs and made tempers short. Here, in this unlikely place, Liesel's stomach had begun to settle, though she felt uneasy at the comfort. She spent her days working, sometimes in the camp laundry, sometimes sent out under guard to nearby farms. The first time she rode past the town square, she saw posters with slogans she couldn't fully read but understood anyway. Stern-faced Uncle Sam pointing, smiling soldiers holding babies, bright flags waving above cheerful type. It was propaganda, she knew, but it was strangely warm. Even the guard who rode with them hummed under his breath, a tune Liesel did not recognize but found herself humming later when no one could hear. Tension coiled under the surface of camp life. Some of the women still wore their loyalties like armor, whispering about victory, about the fatherland's inevitable rise, though their voices faltered when news arrived from the front. Others had grown quiet, eyes distant, as if a great curtain had been pulled back and they were seeing the war for what it was. One night, the silence shattered. A commotion rose near the barracks, angry voices, the thud of fists. By the time the guards broke it up, one of the women lay bleeding from a split lip, her attacker restrained but shouting. Later, word spread that she had been called a traitor for working too eagerly, for smiling at an American sergeant. Fear spread through the bunks like smoke. Liesel kept to herself after that, burying her thoughts under layers of routine. Yet every time she sat at Mary's table, the world outside the wire felt closer, more real. The smell of the roast, the sound of the children's laughter. It was a life that seemed to exist in a different key. One afternoon, while mending torn uniforms under the shade of the laundry shed, Liesel overheard two guards talking. They spoke in low voices about the war, how Paris had been liberated, how the Allies were closing in. She kept her head down, needle flashing, but her hands trembled. Later, she whispered the news to the others, and they sat in a ring on the barracks floor, listening as though the world itself were changing shape outside the fence. The camp commander allowed small privileges for good behavior. There were books in English and German, a few worn decks of cards, even a piano in the recreation hut that one of the women coaxed into song on Sunday evenings. Sometimes, as the notes drifted over the yard, Liesel closed her eyes and imagined she was back home, that her brothers had come in from the fields and her mother was singing over the washing tub. The illusion never lasted, but it was enough to carry her through the next day. Mary noticed the changes too. When Liesel came to the farm now, she moved with a kind of wary confidence, no longer jumping at every sound. She had started humming as she worked, a tune that sounded mournful and lovely at once. The children had grown used to her presence, trailing after her as she weeded or fed the chickens, asking endless questions that made her smile despite herself. But under it all, the war's shadow never fully lifted. The fences reminded her each night when she returned to the camp, the wire catching the last of the sunset like a web. She wondered what waited on the other side of this strange pause in her life. Would she be sent home? Would there be a home to return to? On a cold morning near the end of October, a truck arrived carrying new prisoners, their faces gaunt, their uniforms filthy from the journey. They looked at Liesel and the others with a kind of disbelief, as if they had landed in a dream too good to be true. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy quiet, one of the new women whispered through the darkness that the cities were burning, that whole streets had been turned to ash. Liesel lay awake long after the barracks went still, staring at the ceiling, the wooden boards above her suddenly heavy as a lid. Somewhere beyond the wire, Mary's house waited, with its warm stove and soft light, a world that felt as fragile as it was miraculous. Tomorrow she would be sent there again, and tomorrow she would sit at that table and try to pretend that the war was not creeping closer, step by step, until it found them all. The news came like a thunderclap over the prairie. One May morning, the guards lined up the prisoners and read aloud the words that seemed too large to fit in the air. The war was over. Some women wept with relief, some simply stared, as if the sound had not yet reached them. Liesel stood very still, the wind tugging at her sleeves, and felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted. In the days that followed, the camp changed. The routine slackened, the guards' voices softened. The women walked with a kind of restless energy, as though they had been wound too tightly and now found themselves spinning free. They began to speak more openly, no longer whispering about the front, no longer fearing that the wrong words might bring punishment. But along with relief came the shadow of what came next. Repatriation, the officers called it, as though it were a clean and simple word. In truth, it meant dismantling the strange little world they had built. Liesel folded her uniform with shaking hands and thought of the farms, the fields, the smell of roasted coffee on Sunday afternoons. She thought of Mary. When the truck came to take them back to the processing center, she sat in the bed with the others, the wind snapping her hair loose, the countryside rolling past like a memory already fading. The townspeople stood along the road to watch. Some waved, some turned their backs. Children pointed. It felt less like leaving prison than leaving a place she had secretly begun to call home. Mary stood at the edge of the yard as the truck passed. She did not wave, but her hands were knotted in her apron, her face turned toward the wind so the others would not see her tears. Ruth and Sam shouted goodbyes until the truck was out of sight, their voices high and thin in the wide air. The processing center smelled of ink and sweat. Liesel signed papers she did not read, her name scrawled over and over as though it might anchor her. She was given a parcel of clothing, a train ticket, and a small envelope of pay she had earned in the fields. When she opened it, the coins felt heavy, almost shameful. The journey home was long, rattling through country after country scarred by war. Bombed-out stations loomed like broken teeth, windows patched with cardboard, men with hollow faces staring from the platforms. The closer she drew to Germany, the more the air thickened with smoke and silence. When she stepped off the final train, the station was half collapsed. A cold rain fell, turning the rubble into black mud. She walked through streets that had once been tidy and clean, now choked with bricks, timbers, the charred smell of ruin. The house where she had grown up was gone. Only the foundation remained, weeds already pushing through. Neighbors who recognized her shook their heads, some out of pity, some out of judgment. The hunger returned. Rations were meager, lines long. She traded part of her pay for bread that tasted of sawdust. At night she slept in a barn with other returnees, their bodies curled together for warmth. They spoke little, the language of survival too simple for words. And yet, in those dark weeks, Liesel's memories of America became a lifeline. She saw Mary's kitchen in her mind, the glow of the lamp on the table, the way Ruth had pressed her hand into hers without fear. She wrote letters by candlelight, careful, precise letters to the farm, though she did not know if they would ever arrive. Months passed. Winter came early, and she worked clearing debris from the streets, hauling bricks with raw hands. Some days she thought she heard the faraway hum of that American song the guard had once whistled, and she would pause, staring down the street as though expecting a truck to appear and carry her away again. Then, one gray morning, a letter arrived. The envelope was creased, the ink blurred, but she knew the handwriting instantly. Mary's words were spare but steady. The farm was well, the children had grown, and they thought of her often. Inside was a small photograph of the family standing by the barn, smiling into the camera. Liesel held it until her fingers ached. The letter changed something. She began to move through the city with new purpose, her shoulders straighter, her steps firmer. She took work at a hospital, cleaning floors, then helping with linens, then assisting the nurses. Her English returned in fragments, enough to read old magazines left by American soldiers. People began to notice her calm, the way she never raised her voice, the way she worked until the job was done. But even as she built this small, fragile life, a part of her lived somewhere else. At night she would take out the photograph and place it on the windowsill, letting the pale moonlight fall across it. In her mind she heard the clink of plates, the low murmur of John's voice, the rustle of the wind through corn. The war had ended, but the lines it had drawn inside her had not faded. She was no longer a prisoner, but she was not entirely free either, caught between two worlds that had both claimed her. One evening, as the last light bled across the ruined city, she tucked the photograph back into its envelope and resolved that, if she lived long enough, she would go back. Not to stay, perhaps not even to speak, but to stand once more on that Nebraska soil and see for herself that the house was real, that the table was still there, and that some small part of the world could remain untouched by all the ruin they had survived. Years later, when the ship finally crossed the Atlantic and the train carried her back into Nebraska, the land looked almost dreamlike to Liesel, as though it had been waiting for her all this time. The sky was still impossibly wide, the fields still gold at the edges, the wind still carrying that faint, clean scent of dust and grain. She stepped off at the small station with her single suitcase and stood very still, letting the air fill her lungs like a sacrament. She had not come to stay, she told herself that, but to see, to close a circle that had never quite sealed. Mary was waiting. Older now, her hair streaked with silver, she stood beside the truck, apron tied at the waist as if she had just stepped from her kitchen. For a moment they looked at one another across the platform, the world around them falling silent. Then Mary crossed the space between them and put her arms around her, with a warmth that startled them both. The years dropped away. Back at the farm, everything felt both familiar and changed. The barn had a new roof, the house a fresh coat of paint. Ruth, now grown, came out carrying her own baby, her face lighting when she saw the woman who had once shared her childhood table. Sam shook Liesel's hand, his grip awkward but strong, and called her ma'am, with a shy grin that made them all laugh. Inside, the kitchen was the same, wood stove humming, clock ticking steadily, but the air held a hush, as though aware of the weight of this homecoming. Mary set the table herself, laying out the good china as she had that first Sunday so many years ago. The roast was already in the oven, filling the house with the scent of thyme and onions, rich and warm. When they sat, Liesel found her place was still there, the chair worn smooth where she had once perched stiffly, hands folded in her lap. This time, she sat with her back straight but unafraid, her hands resting loosely on the tablecloth. Conversation came easier now. They spoke of the farm, of the harsh blizzard 2 winters back, of Ruth's wedding, of the years Liesel had spent rebuilding her life from rubble. Mary listened intently, her eyes soft but searching, as though she needed proof that the girl they had once fed had survived. As the meal went on, something inside Liesel eased. She reached for the potatoes without waiting to be offered. She laughed when Sam teased her about the American phrases she had picked up, and she surprised even herself by telling a story about the hospital where she had worked, of a child who had survived against all odds. But beneath the warmth, the memory of war still moved like an underground river. When the conversation turned to those who had not come home, neighbors' sons, cousins, friends, Liesel lowered her gaze. The silence was heavy but not hostile. It was the silence of a wound acknowledged rather than hidden. After the plates were cleared, they stayed at the table, sipping coffee while the baby slept against Ruth's shoulder. Outside, the prairie darkened, and the crickets began their song. John came in from the barn at last, older but still broad-shouldered, his boots leaving dust across the floor. He stood at the head of the table, looking at Liesel with an expression she could not quite read. Then he nodded once and said, "Good you came back." It was not dramatic, but it was enough. When night settled fully, Mary lit a lamp and placed it at the center of the table. Its glow caught their faces, turned the room into a circle of gold against the surrounding dark. For a moment, Liesel felt as though time itself had stilled, as though the war and all its weight had been pushed out beyond the fence lines. She realized, sitting there, that the table had always been more than wood and nails. It had been a border crossing, a line where enemies had once dared to become neighbors. And now, after all the miles and years, it felt like a final armistice. When she rose to leave, Mary walked her to the porch. The wind had softened, carrying the scent of cut hay. The stars blazed overhead, unscarred by smoke or searchlights. Liesel stood very still, her suitcase in her hand, and felt the great, aching distance between the girl who had once stepped off the truck and the woman standing here now. She turned back once, catching sight of the lamplight glowing through the kitchen window, warm as a heartbeat. That image would stay with her for the rest of her life, brighter even than the day the war ended. She understood now that peace had not begun with treaties or surrenders, but with the first plate passed across that table, with the first nod of trust from a farmer's wife. As she stepped into the night, her chest felt both heavy and strangely light. Somewhere in the dark, a train whistle sounded, long and low, as if marking the close of something vast and unfinished. And for the first time since she had left, Liesel smiled. Not the small, wary smile of a prisoner, but the sure, unguarded smile of someone who had finally come home. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.